We are here to celebrate the Royal Docks' 100th anniversary, to introduce you to Ballymore's new Thames-facing development, Riverscape, which is launching on the 25th of September, and to unveil a brand new and insightful piece of research from JLL, which you're actually among the first to be privy to. And this is going to articulate exactly why Royal Docks in London Royal Docks is one of London's most successful and ambitious regeneration areas. It's actually a really exciting time right now for Royal Docks. A further £8 billion is set to be invested in the area, delivering 25,000 new homes and 60,000 jobs over the coming years. And this year, as you may know, the Crystal Building will become home to the Mayor of London and the Greater London Authority, inevitably attracting exciting new business and investment into the area. The Excel Centre is also set to expand by 12,000 square meters, while the Elizabeth Line Crossrail is set to open at Custom House. On top of that, £500 million is being invested into the neighbouring London City Airport to strengthen Royal Docks' direct access to the city and expand global flight routes. So it really is, I mean, looking at all of that, a pretty exciting time for this area. I want to introduce to you our panel. I'm joined tonight by John Morayan, the Group Managing Director of Ballymore, who are the developers behind Riverscape and Royal Wharf, by Glenn Howells, the founder of Glenn Howells Architects, the architectural design firm who's behind Riverscape, by Jackie Amos, founder of Amos and Amos, the interior design firm who are behind all of the beautiful interiors at Riverscape, and Adam Chalice, head of research for JLL, who are a world leader in real estate services and the company behind these new demographics and sales research that are sort of helping to frame tonight's discussion. I just wanted to sort of run through some housekeeping and sort of how tonight is going to unfold. So Adam is going to conduct for us a short presentation outlining JLL's research and their findings. Once we finish that, we're going to participate in a discussion, a sort of panel discussion, and I'm going to leave some time at the end, so please do come up with some questions, and there will be time at the end to answer those. And once we're finished around 8:30, we're going to pick off where we left off with some canapes and drink service. And at that time, the panelists and the sales team will still be available. So if you didn't get a chance to ask that pressing question, if you think of something, just grab someone. Last thing, if I could ask everyone just to put their phones on silent. And as you can see, we are filming this evening. This is for sort of social media and internal usage. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bridget. Real pleasure and privilege to be able to speak to you tonight. My name is Adam Chalice, as Bridget just said. I get to run the research and strategy function for JLL across Europe. And it's particularly exciting for me to be here this evening because as I was saying to John earlier, I remember being here back in 2013 when there were no flats. In fact, there were no cranes, there was nothing yet. And of course, over what is a relatively short period of time in development terms, all of this has been created, an extraordinary community and neighborhood. So for somebody who's been around long enough to see a scheme of this scale come to fruition from what was industrial and formal industrial land, like much of the Royal Docks, it's a pretty extraordinary thing. So a real privilege for me. I hope you don't mind, I've moved down off the stage. Somebody 5'7" shouldn't really be up that high. It's a bit unnerving. I feel more comfortable closer to the ground. So hopefully you folk in the back don't have to crane your necks too much to see me. Why don't we turn the slides and we'll get into the numbers a little bit. You have the research in front of you. So the numbers come at the very end of the presentation, but I guess in truth, giving the game away, you can probably turn to page 2 and see the big final crescendo figures. But I want to take you through the storyline that the team has been working on to develop our new forecast for the local area, and ultimately give you a little bit of market context about what is happening more broadly in London and how the housing market has fared. Of course, it's been a pretty extraordinary, challenging period. All the superlatives have been used up about the pandemic, but as it relates to the housing market, frankly, we're in pretty surprising territory. Certainly from where I expected to be about 15 months ago when I was spending time with government thinking about downside scenarios and how bad it was going to be. Of course, many of the programs that government brought in, furloughing, stamp duty forgiveness, a whole range of programs that are actually really supportive for the housing market, and not least, of course, the lending environment has remained really liquid, really vibrant, and actually really competitive. So for those that are able to take mortgages, of course, being able to get access to relatively cheap rates has been an important fillip to the market overall. The slide in front of you bears that number out. And of course, you've got figures that are representative right across London. This is not a Royal Dock specific narrative, but it shows that continued escalation really from the early part of 2019. So even just sort of predating the pandemic, as you may recall, that acceleration. The red line, of course, is the annualized rate. I'd encourage you to focus on that rather than the gray bars, which are monthly figures, and they tend to be a little bit volatile when it comes to the housing market. So that red line just shows that continued strength and growth, almost against, as I said earlier, expectations. Next slide. So let's unpack some of the reasons why, and this certainly isn't exhaustive. We don't have time to do the full sermon, and I'm sure you don't need me to be speaking that long. You've got canapes and other things to get more excited about. But as it relates to London more generally in the first instance, thinking about London's role in the world, and of course we've had to reimagine to a degree London's position with respect to Brexit, with respect to the pandemic, with respect to a whole range of quite important issues that could impact London's prowess on the global stage. Some other colleagues of mine in our global research team that look really right across the planet and try to understand city performance and dynamism, put together a piece of work on a biannual basis. Their most recent piece of work underpins some of the headlines that I pulled out for you here. I think there might be a little bit more in the pack, and if you're really, really interested, speak to me afterwards and I can send you some links to get into the real gritty stuff, the really good stuff. Of course, I'd say that as a researcher. Transparency, first and foremost. London is an incredibly good place to do business. The Real Estate Transparency Index puts London ahead of any other city on the planet with respect to the ability to flow capital in, the ability to trust the regulatory environment, the ability to set up businesses, to be a vibrant part of this economy, and actually does that better than anywhere else on the planet. And so London continues to really perform very strongly on transparency. Of course, the laws that we sometimes lament in the UK are also exactly what people love about being able to do business in the UK. When you do something, it's enshrined in law that it's yours. Talent, another really, really key factor. In fact, more so than ever, as talent is refreshing itself, the digital transformation has meant that we think about and appreciate talent in a much broader sense than might have traditionally been the case of going to secondary and tertiary education and then getting on into a big corporate career. In fact, the nuances that are much more alive today with respect to the digital economy really do break back to an incredibly deep talent pool in London. So it underpins quite a lot of the new dynamism that is shaping London. Colleagues in central London will talk about the office market having moved from what was traditionally in the square mile, a quarter of occupiers being banks, to somewhere now in the low to mid-teens. And actually, rather than replacing that with other big banks, other financial services, it's tech that has come in and has created a much broader kaleidoscope of businesses, of workers, and ultimately talent that underpins that space. So London not resting on its laurels with respect to talent, really important. And of course, clearly related to that, innovation. We often think about the East in particular. I think about the rise of China, Korea, Japan as the real innovators, the United States, of course, when you go west. But London also more than holds its weight with respect to innovation, the ability to create new businesses, to generate startups. You think about the life science space in particular, and of course, we've been hearing front and center about Oxford and AstraZeneca for some time, and that crucible of real imagination that is happening through the Oxford, Cambridge, and London triangle in just that segment of the economy. It's much more broad-based than that, and it truly is world-class. Next slide. So when we think a little bit more specifically about how the pandemic has reshaped and recast our views of how we want to live, you will have all read much of this, I'm sure, in the property headlines. You don't need me to rehearse the deep detail, but there's no question that as we've spent more time at home, we've learned to appreciate or frankly lament the homes that we have. And we think about, in a different way, the lifestyle. And you'll perhaps have come across a concept called the 15-minute city. Sometimes it's also called the 20-minute city. But basically, what it's about is having all of the day-to-day uses that you have as a part of your daily life, whether that's a coffee shop or a creche or a gym, park space. Having that all within a 15, 20-minute walk is, of course, part and parcel of having a vibrant neighborhood, a vibrant community that is complementing the place that you call home. In an environment where we were commuting maybe longer distance, trying to get to the job and worrying more about the narrow sense of just being well located for work, we gave up on some of those characteristics, some of those attributes in order to get access to the right job. And of course, working from home has given us the opportunity to reevaluate some of those characteristics. It won't surprise you at all that I'm emphasizing that point, sitting where we are now with great access to jobs, but actually being in a very diverse environment with great parks, with waterside amenity, and lots of stuff that many of you in the room will know better than I do, as I think in some cases residents here, certainly people that understand the benefits of having that on your doorstep. That extraordinary change in mindset and a really subtle shift that I think will be quite a permanent change in the way we all view what we call home, or the range of choices that are going to be most important to us when we think about where we want to live. Next slide. So coming on to the big numbers, as it were, and as I said, the numbers are in the document. I hope you'll take away with you that the document, it has lots of additional intel that is, I think, really, really interesting, that underpins perhaps some of the deeper rationale that are behind the figures, but also I think really broadens out with a little bit more statistics, some of the things that I'm just trying to get across to you now. But importantly, the way that we structure forecasts, next slide, really relies first and foremost on some macroeconomic rigor, as you'd expect, thinking about a really strong economic response post-pandemic, so a broad GDP recovery, thinking about that unemployment rate that of course has been hugely protected by the furlough program, and equivalent programs right around the world have all been very successful, or successful in varying degrees. But we were earlier and we were stronger in our protection of our jobs. And the fact that we're still sitting at roughly 5% and expected even to tighten a little bit is an extraordinary statement. That is a really strong jobs market, full stop, let alone in a recovery period. At the same time, you've also got some other really important characteristics from the housing perspective that are worth being cognizant of. Rates of inflation, despite the current sort of blip, are expected largely to taper, and so over the medium term, expected to see relative stability. So people talk about this being a cyclical event because of the supply chains that have been messed up in the pandemic that will sort themselves out early in the new year, but ultimately inflation remaining relatively low. Complementing that, of course, is the relatively still inexpensive or competitive mortgage market that is a real plus for the housing market, and alongside pretty strong earnings numbers, and worth noting a relative strengthening of the pound against the most important currency still, the greenback, the US dollar. And so that expected relative strengthening currency is a real underwrite to the pound sterling. Next slide. So as it breaks back, and this is my penultimate slide, breaks back to the actual figures, expected growth over the next 5 years of around about 30%. If I compare that with our London or UK forecast, which sit closer to about 20%, you can see that expected outperformance in this area because of many of those localized characteristics that I alluded to, that, as I say, that many of you will know personally better than I do. At the same time, we're also expected accelerated rental growth. There has been a weakness in the rental market, of course, through the pandemic, as particularly in city locations as people made choices elsewhere. But we are absolutely conviction buyers in the London story and London's continued strength globally. One of the things that we often talked about in the middle of the pandemic was whether we'd ever really want to connect in the same way again. Well, I'll take you back to really early on in my career. In fact, just before I started my career, when people were talking a lot about the role of the internet and emails starting to disperse workforces, and meaning that city connectivity would be weaker. You would have seen headlines at the time about the death of distance, because of course we were connecting digitally and it was going to be the end of needing to see each other. And what has happened in that time is hyper-urbanization. We have become globally more connected. As much as we want to connect digitally in ever greater frequency, we also, turns out, we kind of like each other. We want to connect more and more as humans. And for somebody who has an office next to Soho, I can tell you that it's buzzing right now. And that's because people still want to connect. And of course, that underpins the role of the city as the engine of growth, the engine of economies, the engine of social connectivity. And so we're big supporters and believers in the continued renewal of city economies. London's been one of the strongest perennially in terms of its ability to re-engineer itself and innovate. And as I showed you in one of my earlier slides, our expectation is very much that London will continue that strength going forward. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Adam. So John, I thought I'd start with you. So obviously, you've been invested in this area for about 15 years, I believe. But what is it actually that first attracted Ballymore to the Royal Docks?
I think originally in the Royal Docks, kind of why we came down here was probably, generally we felt as London expanded, its only really option was to expand east. And, following on from the kind of success of Canary Wharf and the other Dogs, this was the only place it could go. But then when you look specifically at this tract of land where we've invested heavily and continue to invest, you effectively have, you're surrounded on one side by the River Thames and the other side by public transport in the DLR, North Woolwich Road. So, with Crossrail coming, it's just such an incredibly connected place with such an amenity with the river. And if you look at most of the well, for me anyway, most interesting parts of London, very often they do sit near the river. So so I think it was that combination of an amazing kind of natural amenity, the river, two parks, Lyell Park and Barrier Park, and then you're surrounded on the other side by incredible public transport. It kind of felt to us, from a long-term perspective, just like a very obvious place for London to expand into.
And sort of following on from that, what next? What's the future for this area for you?
Well, I think actually it's interesting. Even when Adam was talking about, we were at the same meeting, I think, back in 2013, just before our partners Oxley came on board with Royal Wharf, 13 or 14, and this place looked very, very different. And I think, even the transformation you've seen over the last kind of 5 years, Royal Wharf being a very good example, but also things in terms of, the addition of Crossrail to this area. Like, I think when that comes, I think that just another connection is going to make it just so much more accessible. Obviously, the Mayor of London coming down and City Hall being locating down in this area. I mean, that in terms of City Hall, I just think it in a similar way to what it did to More London and to the South Bank. I mean, City Hall was one of the things that kind of made the South Bank. It gave you that level of credibility when actually in that particular area at the time it maybe hasn't had that. So I think that all the dignitaries who have inevitably come down to City Hall will now be coming down to the Royal Docks, and I think that has to be a huge positive. And Excel, biggest conference centre in London, City Airport continuing to expand. I just think this area has huge potential. We've continued to invest, and to be honest, we will continue to invest in the Royal Docks because we see it as one of the, from a London perspective anyway, one of the places with most potential in the city.
Sure. And I will ask other people questions, but another one for you, John. So Ballymore has obviously been sort of a pioneer in placemaking, and one of the things that you do really well is to create these developments that sort of amenity rich, and this, what Adam was talking about the 15-minute city. You've really been sort of a leader and a pioneer in that. So just tell me a little bit about how Royal Docks, and more specifically Riverscape, embrace in this 15-minute city concept.
Yeah, well, there's a lot. I mean, a lot of people talk about placemaking, and I think the reality is, placemaking is about people. It's about the people who live there. It's about what happens on the ground floor. And what makes me really proud on places like this is when we've people living in our buildings who have also set up their businesses in Royal Wharf as well, which is great to see. And that's really what starts communities. But we've got a school next door to us here, which is always the heart of the community. A great community centre, which we're sitting in today. We've got a great high street, pubs, restaurants, shops, and this community has been built in an incredibly short period of time. And you can just see it. It kind of makes me proud walking around here today to kind of see how quickly that's developed. And I think that will continue to develop because it has only been around for such a short period of time. So as I said, placemaking it is about the people. It is about all about the people. It's about as a developer, what we try and do, things like we're having the Royal Wharf Fete in a few weeks' time, and things trying to get events and trying to get things to try and, in the early stages of building a community, trying to give them reasons to get together and that. But I think down here, the sense I get is that community's gone from strength to strength, and it seems, we're really, really proud of it.
Fantastic. And Glenn, in your role as with your architectural firm, tell me a little bit about how you've approached the Royal Wharf Master Plan, and what were some of the sort of West London streets and squares and parks that provided inspiration for what you've created here?
When we started to look at this project, the first thing that struck us was probably the best kept secret in London, seriously, because it's got the site owned by Ballymore was a kilometre of south-facing Thames side, which you couldn't walk along. And so it was disconnected. And what we also noticed when we started to look at it over 10 years ago was a lot of the developments, both north and south of the river in East London, had been quite sort of opportunistic in a sort of Torremolinos sort of way of just grabbing a view of the Thames and not really thinking about the implications. And what we worked with Ballymore on, and it was quite brave actually, we're just saying, imagine, because what West London does in districts such as Chelsea and Battersea, etc., Fulham, is you get a contiguous piece of city which you can walk along, you can cycle along. Okay, there's places where you're forced off the river because of quite hostile developments, but generally it hangs together as a place. So the approach was from the early, I remember the early conversations with Sean and John and the rest of the team in Oxley, was about creating a real piece of city which hangs together and is open-ended. So other developers, other development can carry on with it. And so it's not a gated community. One of the things, as we go further east, we've got a building which doesn't allow us to go through it. And so that was the sort of plan, which then, the Y-shaped plan, was to go either side of Barrier Point, which is not a bad building at all. But all I'm saying is that sort of typified the approach until Ballymore started to look at this part of land, which it was about developments which then stood their ground but were quite sort of isolated. And so the approach here was to create a district, and as John said, we've got DLR and quite a busy road there, and then we've got the river. But if you look at other parts of London, such as Chelsea, Fulham, Wandsworth, you've got then back from the waterfront, you've got a thriving high street, you've got different scales of squares. So the idea was to almost graft a piece of real London, like the great estates actually, Cadogan Estate, which is a combination of squares, streets, and if you walk around this place, and it's great coming back with people walking and going through it now, because the problem with being an architect, you sort of live in CGI world for about 5 years before anything gets real. And so you have to sort of imagine it. But actually, it is better in many ways than we imagined, because all the things about the shifts in scale between big spaces and small spaces, and which is characteristic of London. London, we don't realise, is a really curious city. It's very different to Paris, very different to New York, because what you've got in London is variety and shifts in scale and irregularity, but with an underlying order. And that's what we tried to transplant, and I think with some degree of success, into East London.
Certainly. And Glenn, John mentioned already that there's a school right here. I think we might even have the head teacher of the school in the audience tonight. And so I just wondered how sort of education was central to the success of a new town, specifically how you incorporate schools and family amenities into your development plans.
I mean, the ambition from the outset was to create a real place, not something which is a condominium or a luxury development which is exclusive. We wanted to create, and what I heard earlier, I was talking to someone on the sales team, they're saying, so many people who have bought in at entry level on quite a small home here, their aspiration is to move to a larger home here. That's the best, actually, recommendation we could ever have. Because I think, and part of that, going back to your question about the school, is it wouldn't work as a real place without a school, a shop, the nursery. All of this infrastructure isn't there because of planning demands. It's there because it makes it real. And the critical decision was where to put the school, because you could have put it out onto the road, and there was a big discussion where it should be. And somebody said, oh, it's a really valuable site, you know, for such a low building. Actually, where we've put it, I think, works brilliantly because it's in the heart of the development. It's right in the middle of it, and it's the sound of the children arriving. So it's got a different, it's also got a vital ingredient in that it sort of is the beating heart of the place.
And moving from the sort of exterior of the buildings in this master plan, Jackie, obviously what you're looking at is the insides and the sort of the soft furnishings and the flow of the buildings and the public spaces. So talk to me a little bit about how nature and the sort of exterior world influence the interiors of the spaces you created here at Riverscape.
Well, I think Riverscape is one of the greenest new build developments in London at the moment. So it was very natural that we took a lot of inspiration from that, from the kind of smaller pockets of green space dotted around the estate, and also from the larger kind of parks at either end, and in particular here, Lyle Park, which is directly adjacent to the site. So if we look at some of the interior spaces, the lobbies, for example, typically when we approach the design of a lobby, we're looking at creating a space which is almost like a very calm kind of oasis, a sanctuary away from the bustling kind of city. It's a very inward-facing space. And actually at Riverscape, it's completely the opposite to that. So our brief was completely different. We had this incredible series of lobbies which have sort of floor-to-ceiling, wall-to-wall glazing at both ends. And so really the function of the lobby became to be a beautiful backdrop to those views. And that's really how we approach them. So in terms of the materiality, we have very soft kind of desaturated green tones. We have slatted timber ceilings which serve to kind of dampen down the acoustics in the space and make them feel very quiet and soft and comfortable. And on the floors, instead of using an interior finish, we've actually used the external floor, which continues through into the lobby. So it's this beautiful kind of tumbled edged, long herringbone stone floor. And I think that kind of continuity from outside to inside, it just serves to completely blur those lines between the interior and the exterior green spaces.
Fantastic. And I'm sure everyone in this audience will have personal experiences with this. And Adam spoke about it in his research, but the last year and a half has really led to a lot of people rethinking their home, what they want from their home, even how they want their homes physically set up and how rooms should be situated. And I wonder how, Jackie, that influenced what you've been doing in terms of the layouts and the floor plans of the buildings, and also the interiors that you've designed.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what was interesting was when we started to get into the real kind of in-depth space planning for the apartments at Riverscape, it was exactly probably kind of March 2020. So it coincided exactly with this sort of change to everyone's life and the way we were all kind of working and functioning. So it put us in a really unique position where we were able to be very agile and respond very immediately to the kind of changing needs of occupants and owners. So I think what it ultimately came down to was that these spaces had to be incredibly flexible and almost kind of multifunctional. There had to be lots of spaces which could take on different usages depending on the occupant's needs. Even as far as kind of, if you're looking at working from home, you know, some people are doing 1 day a week, they might need a little touchdown point in their apartment. Other people are working 5 days a week from home and might want to take, for example, the winter garden, the full space as an office. Other people might have that as an extension to their living room, or put a dining table in for entertaining, or have it as a kids' playroom. You know, there's so many kind of functions and sort of flexibility built into those apartments.
Which is like fantastic for people moving in now, that that's sort of all just been built into, you know, what you've already created. And Adam, as you obviously sort of spoke about in your presentation, some of the facts and figures, but one of the things that you mentioned was that the Royal Docks will see a 30% increase in house prices over the next 5 years, and sort of the end of 2026 with buyers really attracted to this sort of fantastic riverside location and lifestyle. But I wonder, how does that sort of sit with what's happening in London in general?
Yeah. Well, I guess, Bridget, you probably did my job for me in your opening remarks, talking about the amount of investment coming into this area in particular. And you know, I wouldn't gloss over the magnitude of that investment, of course, in infrastructure and connectivity. John mentioned Crossrail, which gets going through Custom House in 2022, and of course with expanded capability of the airport and so much that is happening. It's you know, of course, been a feature of this region of London for the best part of 15 years that you've seen on average strengthening price growth relative to elsewhere, in large part because of that regeneration, the activity. I think 15 years ago we used to talk about London population being 50% east of Tower Bridge, and I suspect that has marched a little bit further over as we've seen more and more populations bring life to the ex-industrial, the ex-Docklands, and turn this part of London into a vibrant hub in its own right. So that story has been a really important backdrop. But at the same time, where we are today, relative to many other bits of London, is a more affordable location. So as you know, I had the opportunity to wander around and refamiliarize myself with the site, and watching families and young professionals coming home from work, and the vibrancy that was happening, frankly, isn't a dynamic that you get to see everywhere, because you know, in many bits of London, it's too expensive for that type of occupier profile to be able to afford this. We all know that London's a pretty challenging place often. So that you can still find great value and see that longer term upside is a key part of the factor that, or one of the main factors that underwrites that above average rate of price growth that we anticipate over the next 5 years.
And Glenn, both you and John have spoken about sort of just how unique it is to have this amount of sort of riverside property and sort of undeveloped riverside property. But I wonder if you could even speak a little bit further, sort of about how that's sort of impacted in terms of the history of London and this development, and moreover why the Clipper and these riverside communities are so vital to London and sort of its evolution.
Yeah, I mean, for many years, up until the Second World War, the river was regarded not as an amenity, but as a liability. And so it was sort of, you see many parts of London where it turned its back on it. And so when we found this piece of London, it was amazing that you've got effectively almost a coastal amount of water. And you appreciate the tidal shift more than any other part of London. And then you've got these amazing parks. And I think our job was relatively easy. It was pretty straightforward, because all we had to do was connect the pearls along the sort of necklace, really, because you've got two parks, we added another park. And so what we've had the opportunity and the opportunity to do here is to create a riverside experience, which I think is one of the best, if not the best, in terms of south-facing river frontage. I can't think of anywhere else where it's not blighted by cars and infrastructure, and so we've had the opportunity to release this 1 kilometre of water frontage with a really generous boardwalk and with parks along it is amazing. And Riverscape is a culmination in a way, because it's got the best outlook. It looks, as you can see from this picture, it's got this amazing view to the west, so sunsets, and it's got a view down towards the city and towards the dome, etc. And because of the curve in the river there, it's got this amazing sort of view out of it. So I think we've done the best, actually, job at releasing the potential of that. And you mentioned the clipper. So it's not just a visual amenity. That was one of the things that we spoke about early on this project, was how can it be part of your journey to work? How can it be part of your lifestyle, that you are able to commute, not by road or by rail, that you can commute by water as well. So it's having the clipper stop. We sort of joked about it at the beginning of the job, thinking it would never happen. But if you imagine it, it does happen.
Very cool. Well, so tonight obviously is laudatory and really sort of exciting moment, but I wouldn't be doing my job right if I didn't ask some critical questions. So Adam, I'm going to throw this to you. What risks do you see in sort of these forecasts? It all sounds pretty great.
Oh, thanks for that, Bridget. That's great. The risks is a good question. There, of course, are always macro risks, and in this environment more so than most. I clearly the team didn't see the pandemic coming and what we would call a black swan event, and that has distorted, I suppose, many of the presumptions we would have had a couple of years ago about the way the market has played out. And clearly, as I suggested, even a year ago, we were thinking more about the downsides than we were the reverse, and it's the reverse that has taken place. And I don't want that to undermine what we've done, because of course there's some big unknowns that are a part of macroeconomic forecasting and micro forecasting. As it relates to the forecasts in the Royal Docks, the risks that I often worry most about are particularly in the housing market related to politics, and I don't want to be getting drawn on and making any political statements. But of course, so much of what we've talked about, those big commitments, big investments, they rely on longer term vision, not just from the private sector, from developers, but also from politicians, from civil servants, to see these things through. And political cycles are much shorter than often development cycles. We were talking about this earlier, and clearly this scheme is a good example of that. This development is a good example, this neighbourhood, of being able to see that long-term commitment through. So for me, risks are often related to those external factors that are beyond control of the developer, and in particular, dare I say it, our politicians of all stripes tend to politic and tend to use the housing market sometimes as a plaything rather than something that is genuine about trying to solve some of the challenges that Londoners have. That's where I would place my risks.
Sure. Or a global pandemic that no one's
sure.
expecting. And I obviously mentioned this in my introduction, but I sort of feel it's sort of impressive and exciting enough that it's actually sort of worth stopping on again. So Sadiq Khan, is the Mayor of London, is moving out here, and he's even sort of said, Royal Docks, it's an amazing place, and that they have this sort of incredible moment and opportunity to turbocharge the regeneration of this area with the opening of City Hall. So this is one for you, John. If you can sort of maybe speak about what that opening and that sort of commitment from the Mayor means for this area.
Well, there's been some comparables. I mean, we used to. I remember when we were working down in a project down in Nine Elms, and we talked about the US government moved from Grosvenor Square down to our project there, and it was. We used to say it was about changing people's mind map of London, because at that point in time, if you had said Nine Elms to anybody in this room, they probably wouldn't have a clue where you were talking about. But when the US government decided they were going to move their embassy there, all of a sudden people said, "What the hell are they doing? Where are they going?" And I think Google going to King's Cross was another moment where all of a sudden, one of the biggest companies in the world going to King's Cross, and it went from King's Cross being somewhere where you felt was maybe might happen. All of a sudden, Google are going there. They're bringing their European headquarters, and it was an absolute. And rents went from £50 a foot to £90 a foot over the course of 12 months. And I think the City Hall and the Mayor of London moving to Nine Elms, I think it's not necessarily directly just what the people working there will do or the people visiting there will do. But I think we'll change people's perception of what the Royal Docks is, because when the people think of the Royal Docks, all of a sudden they'll think of the Mayor of London, they'll think of City Hall. I think this is actually one of the central places of the city. And I think so not necessarily in terms of just its direct impact on the location, but I think in terms of how people perceive this area, I think it's immense. And I think you won't until, and similar to kind of Crossrail, because it's until you can actually sit on that train and get to Heathrow Airport in 42 minutes, actually it's a bit of a pipe dream. But I mean, I think when that actually happens, I do think perception of what the Royal Docks is will be different.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the research that Adam presented to us at the beginning, he mentioned these sort of three pieces: connectivity, green spaces, and vibrant amenities. Those are sort of what people are looking for, and that's sort of what makes a community. And I mean, 3 out of 3, you guys have nailed it. You've got those right here. And I wonder, Glenn, when you were sort of designing the sort of the overall plans, are there any sort of specific amenities or design features that you sort of brought in or thought of, or even that sort of create this modern development that really speaks to what people want right now?
Are you talking about Riverscape or the whole development?
The whole development.
Yeah, I mean, we set out on this project because as architects you try to do quite sort of fancy buildings occasionally, but the brief on this was to do a landmark place, not a series of landmark buildings. And we all kept on repeating that to each other all the way through it. So the success of it is creating a fantastic district to live in, where the buildings are judged against each other and it's an integrated sort of place. And as John said earlier, what happens at ground floor is pretty much essential to getting that sort of feel and placemaking's an overused term. I think in terms of the most important thing is to create opportunities at ground floor where people can meet each other and interact. It's a very ancient idea, but it's what actually makes the most successful places work, is where you have opportunities for more than living or working to come together. And I think what we've been trying to do is to irrigate the ground floor throughout the site. Traditionally, developers would have only looked towards the river in this part of London. And I think what we've tried to do is to bring the life into the central space, around the school, along the central route. And so the creche, the school, the bars, the cafes. And on our walk over here, we were talking about some of the opportunities, because some of the ground floor space is still to be developed. And there's a commitment within the Ballymore team, not actually just to fill it with anything, and I think it's completely the right idea, is to cultivate the right ground floor activity, which is long-term and adds character and adds sort of permanence to the place. So I think it's incredibly important. And at Riverscape, we've got probably one of the best locations on that sort of southwest corner there to have a public space, and I think that could be actually magnificent as well, because of its relationship to the pub. And again, we're very fortunate because we've had big sort of, we've had lots of help from existing infrastructure. Lyle Park, when we first looked at it, you had to find your way through it. You couldn't, where was it? There were signposts. I think Riverscape and Royal Wharf will help it and to release it into what it always should have been, which is a great amenity for the whole of East London. Yeah, so, there's tennis courts, there's play spaces in it, you've got this amazing raised green area overlooking the Thames. What we hope is that what the development here and the number of people, because the thing which I think Newham seized upon when they saw this is, what we can't underestimate is the scale and the ambition of Royal Wharf. Lots of other people have been talking about creating a development. This has happened, yet in a very short period of time. I mean, the people who know the people who know on the planet are absolutely, and that's why one of the reasons I think why the mayor is very keen to be associated with it, because lots of other districts, a lot of parts of London have talked about regeneration, but I do believe that it's happened at pace, and there's a sort of critical mass of people living and being here at the moment, which enables all that ground floor stuff to work as well.
Mm. And one of the through lines of the conversation tonight has been around the way that our lives have changed over the last year and a half, and the way that we use our living spaces differently. So one of those things, I guess, is a lot of people working from home, which means you're sort of in your flat at times that you perhaps never were before. And Jackie, I wonder, how the way that you've used light within the design, if you could talk a little bit about that.
So the first time I came here, we stood over on the corner right by the river wall where the show apartment is now located. And we spent a whole day here, and we kept on kind of going back to that corner and just watching like the changing light across the water over a 12-hour period was absolutely amazing. And I think straight away it was very clear that that had to become a fundamental part of the interior design approach to the spaces. And then we have these apartments with these phenomenal kind of large picture frame windows. So we worked really hard with the team to achieve the kind of deep window reveals which could house window benches. And I think those are so unique and offer this kind of beautiful opportunity to just take a little bit of time out and just kind of turn your back almost physically and metaphorically on everything that's going on and just have a little moment and look out over the river. And I love this idea that all the residents will have kind of their favorite time of day, that they'll sit there, you know, in the morning with their coffee or in the evening with a glass of wine. So that was kind of an integral kind of part of the design approach. And then in terms of the materiality, again, trying to pick up on that kind of reflections on the light on the river and the refractions of the water. So the reeded glass on the kitchen cabinets and the fluted stone in the bathroom all kind of subtly sort of bring that message through into the interior spaces.
Sure. And we've spoken a fair bit about the sort of buyer's market and what's happening, sort of buyers, sellers, and politically, but also, you know, a big part of this is renters. And so I wonder, Adam, this is a question for you. You've forecast that rental growth is going to be strong in 2022 and 2023, especially when Crossrail opens. I wonder sort of what you think the modern renter is looking for versus a buyer.
Another really good question. I mean, the first thing I think is important to say is that there, for me, isn't a distinction in terms of what people are looking for, whether you happen to be a renter or happen to be an owner. I mean, you're living in the space. You want to have certain, you know, standards of quality of life. One of the reality of most renters is they tend to be a little bit more price sensitive, of course, so they want to see best value for the place that they're renting, and are a little bit easier to move around. So if they don't get what they want, they tend to move. So actually renters are a pretty good litmus test for whether you've got a place that works, because frankly, if it doesn't, renters will find somewhere else. But I guess trying to be more helpful and answer your question more directly, one of the real characteristics that we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years, certainly in London, is that the average age of the renters, I think we all know, has started to creep up. And it would have traditionally been the case that the renter was sort of pre-family formation stage. And clearly that's not the case anymore. In fact, about a third of renting households in the UK are households with children. And that says to me a lot about the wider amenity, not just in the home, but the wider amenity of the place. And some of the comments that we've already heard about with respect to the school, with respect to the creche next door, safe walking environments for children, all of that contributes to the needs of particularly that modern interpretation of the renter. But I'll sort of reject the idea that it's a specific renter mindset, because frankly, whether you choose to rent or whether you choose to own, you have some expectations about the way you want to live. They've been reframed a bit by the pandemic over the last couple of years, but those expectations haven't changed.
Sure. And before we open it up to audience questions, I thought I'd finish on one final question that actually I'm going to ask of everyone. And maybe starting with you, John, if you don't mind. You could just say what your favorite place on the development is, or your sort of favorite view.
I think the pier. I think when you walk out to the pier and you're sitting on the apex of that angle that faces east towards the Thames Barrier, I think just the view of you feel like you're standing in the middle of the river, and the view back towards the development is amazing. But the view of the river and the Thames Barrier is just incredible. So on a calm day when the tide is really high and just sits right under the pier, that's a nice spot.
Glenn?
I love the new park because it's a very green area, but then this huge new piece of oasis that has been inserted. It was very brave, and to see it full with families on a weekend on a great sunny day is amazing. So and also I just enjoy seeing the areas which are now really busy with people walking up and down. So I agree with John.
Just one area.
Sorry? Oh, okay, right, okay. Well, I was going to say I'm going to go to three because I also secretly like the townhouse street as well, because it's that weird change in scale that nobody expected.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
You're making it hard for, you don't have to have an original one.
I think for me, it's got to be the window seat, sitting, looking out over the river, preferably with a large glass of wine by my side.
I don't want to make alcohol a theme, and I have two, but I got the chance to walk down earlier this evening and to discover that the pub was up and running and live right on the river. For me, of course, was great in and of itself, but also that space which, to Glenn, your earlier point, that would normally be, having spent a lot of time around a lot of developments, that would normally be a space where a developer has maximized value and has found a premium purchaser and has frankly removed that option for somebody like me who's coming off the street. For me, it was a fantastic find, and I really loved being able to have that moment to discover that. And the second one for me is actually probably a little more prosaic and boring, is coming in off of the DLR, and just that what I'll call probably a bit too pompous, but a bit of an arrival experience, if you like. As I came down the angled lane, I don't know the name of it, and I could just see the square in front of me. I could see commercial spaces that were up and running and vibrant. And that arrival experience, if you come into a neighborhood, for somebody who, frankly, it was last year when it was a dirt track and not much else, that was a really extraordinary moment, because it was not just a place, not just a development. It wasn't just commercially successful, which is often what we think about when we think about what our clients are trying to do. It was a real place. It was a real neighborhood, and that for me was certainly a moment that I'll reflect on.
Fantastic. Well, I would love to take a few audience questions, and we do have a roaming microphone that Charlotte has. And if you want to maybe direct who your question is for, and don't be shy.
Hey, good.
Thanks. Hi, John Mills. I guess it's a question for John, or maybe Glenn. I was struck walking here from Pontoon Dock, the number of kids I saw out playing or walking a dog with their parents. You've touched on this a little bit, but I've always thought of this part of London as being sort of Singleton's heaven. So apart from the obvious point of the school being next door, what do you think the fundamental attribute of this location is that would draw a family here as opposed to locations further west?
I mean, Adam was touching on this earlier on. If you had asked, I think 15, 20 years ago, we were building projects in and around East London, and I think, to be honest with you, the profile was very much that. It was couples, it was singletons, it was, and it has changed so dramatically across all of our developments in East London, but particularly this one. But I think the fundamental reason why Royal Wharf and Riverscape are so great for kids is, firstly, the spaces are a little bit bigger. So the internal spaces that we've been, the apartment sizes here tend to be a little bit bigger. You're between two parks, and I have 3 young kids, and anyone who has young kids knows being close to a park and a playground is incredibly important. You've obviously got the school and you've got the creche, and you actually have there is a breeding space in this part of the city, and you walk along the river or you walk into the parks that you actually don't have in lots of other parts of East London. So I think if you're a family, if you're working in East London, you work in Canary Wharf, or you work anywhere, I suppose ultimately the Crossrail, you can get anywhere in the city, but particularly for people working in East London, it's an incredible. I used to live very close to here in East London. I used to find myself with I've since moved a little bit further away, but we used to find ourselves coming down here to grab a coffee, walk into Barrier Park, and because the playground and everything in Barrier Park is just so easy, and when you're quickly with young kids, I think that's really attractive for families. And I think lateral living, the other thing actually, which one of the things about Riverscape, we have a large number of kind of 3 beds or 2 bed pluses, and They could be a home office, but they could also be a nursery for a kid. But lateral living, if you've got young kids, particularly babies and kids up to the kind of 2 years old probably, the advantage of lateral living on your back compared to living in a Victorian terrace, 3 stories high or whatever, are incredible. When we had our young kids, we lived in a lateral flat, and when we moved into a 3-story house. And it's pretty, it's amazing the difference on your well-being by just lateral living with young kids is amazing. So I think more and more people are seeing. I think more traditionally people felt, I have kids, I have to find a house. I actually think in the future, I think that mindset could change fairly dramatically, as it has done in probably most parts of Europe and the States and Asia.
Yeah, certainly, most bits of the world, not named the UK, actually. Yeah.
I mean, just to add to that, did you say it was a breeding place?
Breathing.
I hope not.
I think we work with lots of developments, so we're slightly, so we're not Ballymore, but from the outset, this place was never greedy, and so it has got a sort of generosity, and because it was actually in a place where there was a point at which it was because it was so big and empty and there was very little going on. There was a worry about whether it would actually work. So looking back 10 years, because there was lots of industry around, and it was empty, and so that gave us the opportunity not to cram too much on, because actually, what the ambition was, I remember the conversation. Let's make it really special so people want to be here. We had to sort of change the weather here in order for it to be successful. You had to, didn't you? Do you remember? Yeah. And so I think the scale allowed us to do that, but also the generous distances between, it feels safe, it doesn't feel cramped, and it's got loads of green. And we didn't, at that point, no one had a clue what we'd be heading into.
Yeah. And then the truth was, those townhouse streets, were far more valuable as apartment.
Oh yeah.
Side of the streets. But I think you're right, it was kind of getting that scale right and making it feel like a town. Something that felt was really important. I think it has proven to be true.
I remember we were working with Newham, and there was someone called Clive Dutton. I don't know if anybody can remember him, but he's sadly passed away now. But he had the vision. He said, "Let's create a place in East London, which when you come here, because Newham at that point was a transitional place, and there were lots of people coming in and working. And then everyone wanted to be somewhere else. He said, let's create a district, a place in East London, in Newham, where people come, want to stay, and they might move to different properties. But it's aspirational, not just affordable. And that was what we set out to do, wasn't it?
Well, I think everyone heard me when I said there were going to be more drinks and canapes after this, so I understand where you're coming from. And everyone will still also be around if you want to sort of ask any questions afterwards, so please feel free. But perhaps this is a good moment to end on. And first of all, thank you to everyone who's come out this evening. And then a huge thank you to our panelists for speaking this evening and providing so many fantastic and really sort of helpful and genuine insights about what's happening out here. So thank you all so much.